maybe they can start by at least having some kind of surveillance mechanism on their fiscal budgeting. If they're not going to have a common tax regime all across, because that is the more difficult side of fiscal policy. But that has to be thought of. Somebody has to think out of the box. Somebody has to gather others to buy into that and move forward.
This isn't a session about youth unemployment, but let me again try and push it towards governability. The issue of whether, with the imperative to create new forms of work which are remunerated for the next generation, whether educated or unskilled, is that something that global governance or governability is a factor in or not? In other words, can it be worked on in a way? We've had all these warnings about the bulge of, for the next generation, the 15 to 24-year-olds for a long time, from the UNDP, from others for a long time, but still it's a major challenge. Jean-Pierre.
Yeah, you know, I think that one of the problems that we have right now is the constant search for instant solutions. So G20 meetings take a day and a half or thereabouts, and you come out with communiques, and you're supposed to be able to give this as a sort of guide map going forward. I think it absolutely has to be an issue for governability. You know, this is, as I say, we have to be thinking very much oriented towards the future. I don't have any instant solution for solving youth unemployment. If I did, I would be in Oslo in December picking up my Nobel Peace Prize. And I'm not sort of expecting this to take place. What worries me is that it's not sufficiently on the agenda. That on the agenda of any kind of agenda of national or global governance. So we say these things, oh, we have 50% youth unemployment in Spain or whatever, and then move on to the next subject. Whereas this is really, again, what worries me is that there's so much focus on the very near term as opposed to the longer term and trying to find the longer term solutions. I think, you know, think about this. If there's no hope, if youth has no hope in the future, there's no hope for the future. This should be the really central concern of policymakers, business persons. The Singapore Global Dialogue, you know, should be dedicating a good deal of time to this, all of us, saying, you know, how do we make the global economy robust and motivate the next generations to feel that they're going to be part of it. Now, there are a lot of things that can be done. For example, in you know, restrictions on starting businesses. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of where I really feel hopeful is when I see these youth entrepreneurs, a lot of them technology-oriented, pretty much all over the world. That should be allowed to flourish. But there's so many barriers in many economies to establishing these kinds of things. So we have to think in terms of the next generations and ensure that policies are directed in that direction.
Dr. Kawai, again, this issue of governance, governability, and the impact on creating growth with work, particularly for the next generation, the younger generation.
Well, maybe partly a structural issue, as Jean-Pierre just mentioned briefly, but essentially the global economy is not growing. And I think we need first growth, austerity. It's going to be very, very difficult. Growth supporting policies would be very, very important. And of course, investing more into education and on-the-job training. So I think rather than this global governance issue, governance per se, but the balancing the need to consolidate the budget in Europe and creating growth. Of course, youth unemployment issue is not limited just to Europe.
Yeah, we could have a much longer conversation about this. Roberto, very quickly, is there anything you want to add on this, or shall I move on?
Well, just very quickly, if you're looking at it from a domestic side, then definitely answers to unemployment will depend on country-to-country policies. If you're looking at it from a universal side as a problem, one possibility to think about is that there must be much more mobility across borders in order that opportunities don't arise only in one country, but opportunities become global.
Because one of the things that happens in a time of crisis is people instinctively say, keep migrants out. It can't happen in the European Union. Right, let's pick up. We've got 15 minutes to run. Over there, please.
A first question for...
Could you just introduce yourself?
Yan Qingyang from China Business News. First question for Professor Kawai. You raised or lay out a very interesting structure, kind of a bi-layer global governance new structure. It seems to me that you mean that the regional regional body of that means a kind of alternative instead of complementary to the global ones. Take the AMRO and kind of AMF as an example. Do you mean, or do you think, how big is the arm chest will be adequate for the AMF or AMRO to become an alternative instead of a complementary to the IMF? And also, do you think the 20% delink is too low? Do you think how high is optimal? Maybe 100% or 80%? First question. And second question for Secretary Campro, I'm sorry. We all know that it's obvious that in the upcoming IMF and World Bank annual conference, Tokyo will make zero progress in terms of the governance and voices reform because the United States will not pass the reform because of the domestic politics reasons. How will you suggest the 188 finance ministers in the IMF meetings to cope with this difficulty? Because you are former finance minister.
Why are you so pessimistic? There'll be no progress.
The United States will not pass this reform. And you know that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Pass the mic. Someone else there had their hand up behind you. Yeah, Roberto. That second question. Whoa. I'm just going to get those questions answered first.
Can I clarify which specific reform were you talking about? Is it the structure of the organization or the reform of?
Emerging markets raise the shares in the governance structure. It is called governance and voice reform. Yeah, it's the most important thing in upcoming annual conference in Tokyo. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think that this discussion about voting rights and so forth is a continuing one. In fact, some progress has been made. If we're looking at this particular IMF meeting in order to provide the definitive solution and the new proportions and so forth, I probably tend to think that that may not happen all that quickly. If you're looking for, let's say in an organization like ADB for a fundamental change in how they select the president, that is also an evolving matter. I did say, especially since you're coming from China News Agency, did I get that right? I did say earlier that part of the reason that these reforms are maybe taking an evolutionary course is because even a country like China does not want to immediately present itself as the leader. Time and time again, I end up in conferences like this, where people would talk about the growing importance, the dominance, and so forth of China, only to have the Chinese speaker say that, no, we are still a developing country, and so forth and so on. And I think rightly so. They need to do something first about their financial internal mechanisms before they can project themselves with credibility in the world financial community. And they're taking those steps. So I'm not really too jumpy that things will not immediately happen in this particular meeting, but I'm particularly optimistic that that evolution continues.
Dr. Kawai, that other question for you.
The lessons from the Eurozone crisis or the crisis in Europe, generally including countries outside of Europe, Eurozone, suggest that even though the EU can play a significant role in managing financial crisis, often the IMF is needed. In Asia, if a future crisis is very small, the future Asian Monetary Fund can manage the crisis. But if a crisis becomes very large, involving many countries with potential implications for global spillovers, then clearly the AMF and IMF would have to work together. So the AMF is not really an alternative to the IMF. It's a great complement. So that's why the AMF, currently AMRO and Chiang Mai Initiative, they have to start working closely with the IMF. Now this delinking issue, currently 20%, it should become 100%. In other words, Chiang Mai Initiative would have to become completely independent of the IMF. But still, an independent Chiang Mai Initiative or an independent AMF can still work with the IMF. The European Union is not tied with the IMF, but the EU chooses to work with the IMF.
Although they do have an understanding in places like Greece of working together. Right, who's got the microphone here? Someone has the microphone. No, yes. Do you have the microphone? Yes, use it.
Thank you. I was intrigued by Jean-Pierre's discussion about...
Remind us who you are.
Sorry?
Remind us who you are.
Oh, I'm Melly Anthony from RSIS. I just wanted to push Jean-Pierre further. I was intrigued by your description about elements that lead to this tectonic shift and all the other things that come along with it, global market orientation, ICT, demographic changes, climate change, etc. When dealing with global economic problems, it seems to me, I'm hearing, it's the same thing, instruments, institutions, banks, etc. If I could push your imagination, can there be other actors involved in managing global economic crises like this?
Well, remember, we're talking about institutions and so on.
Sure. I mean, institutions, in this instance, as I'm listening, is about banks, what they can do, governments, etc. But when you talk to people who occupy Wall Street, when you talk to those NGOs that once upon a time almost threatened the WTO meeting in 1996, how do you talk to them when you say we have to find a way to deal and manage the crises?
Anything else we should put in the mix when it comes to considering governability?
I think that to talk about the global economic crisis, for example, as we do now, is somewhat artificial. You cannot isolate economics from other parts of the planet, other parts of human society. I think that, for example, in the case of Europe, I think a lot of the focus is on the economic crisis, whereas in fact the cause is political, not economic. And I think there's a failure to understand the interconnections between this. The point I'm making, if you like, is that there should be a capacity now to look at problems from historical perspectives, anthropological perspectives, cultural perspectives, philosophical perspectives, economic perspectives, literate perspectives, and all the rest of it. Look at the aspirations of people. I think the economics profession, I know there's a few here, and I suppose I pretend to be one occasionally, has a lot to answer for failing to understand the human emotions. Paper I wrote recently saying emotions are taking over from economics. I think the assumption that is made in economics that behavior is rational is not necessarily correct. And so this is where I come back to. There has to be a message to humanity. There has to be a sort of a sense that we are, that we have a sort of caring global community. When we started off 15 years ago or thereabouts, it was very fashionable to talk about the global village. You don't hear about that anymore because, of course, it's become somewhat of a farce. But we should still be thinking in terms of creating a global village. We should be still thinking in terms of being able to link. Sorry?
Roberto, and I want to come to one more question in a moment. Roberto first.
Let me say, yes, if there's something to add, I would say the private sector. A lot of the time when we talk about institutions and so forth, we're talking about quasi-public institutions, governments, and so forth. APEC started out without having the private sector around, and they soon realized that a lot of the driving force and influence, and you might say the ownership of this entire trade and business and entrepreneurship and so forth belongs to the private sector. Not to mention the fact that private sectors in different countries evolve as they interact with each other. So I'd say the private sector.
That's fascinating, governability and the private sector. But we've only got 2 minutes left, and I'm going to ask you to be brief, please.
I forgot to introduce myself before. My name is Pradyumna Rana. I'm from RSIS. In an increasingly interdependent world, monetary architecture, financial architecture is decentralizing. And number one question is leadership of that architecture, as the panel has already discussed. Number two would be what Nick, you said, how to promote complementarity between global and regional institutions. That has occupied G20 for a long, long time. We don't have clear-cut answers yet. But maybe the European model could tell us something. Mario Draghi, the ECB, will not buy bonds unless a country has worked out, country XYG has worked out a facility with the ESSF or the ESM.
Is there a question, please?
Yes, Trioca. So you have the IMF, ECB, and the EU working together. Could that model be useful for Asia? This is a question for Kawai-san. Whether if you have an AMF, or even if we don't, we have the CMIM, could the CMIM and the IMF work closer together,
right,
perhaps in joint conditionality and pooling resources?
Thank you. Dr. Kawai.
Yes, I would say in the case of Asia, the Troika would consist of the AMF or Chiang Mai Initiative. The IMF may come if a crisis is big, and ADB can play a very, very important supportive role because of the inherent needs to mobilize fiscal resources for various purposes, banking sector recapitalization, the needed investment to support the demand, and so forth. So I would say that would be a troika in Asia.
Jean-Pierre, do you want to add at all?
I agree.
Will we have agreement? Roberto?
Yes, I think he covered it.
All right, we have consensus up on the platform, among three anyway. The time is up, and we're about to go on to the next remarks up here on the platform. Can I thank you all very much indeed? And the question was asked, is the world economy governable? I think what we've shown that in an hour and 3/4, we can put the issue on the table, we can come up with the principle that there has to be some kind of reform and rebuilding and recalibration, but it's a lot more difficult to get when you start digging down deeper into the undergrowth of that very simple and attractive question. And as we've all said, I think up on the platform, I've prompted the panelists to say, it is as much about leadership as governability. So thank you all very much indeed, and I leave the floor to the next guest, Barry.
The continent to improve economic conditions such as lowering inflation, trimming foreign debt, and reducing budget deficits. These changes bode well for sustained economic growth. Africa's long-term economic prospects are quite strong, and its development partners are beginning to view the continent as an investment destination and not just a charity case. Indeed, total private investment in Africa at $53 billion in 2007 now surpasses the foreign aid that it receives. According to the World Bank, a significant portion of that investment has come from China. And so overall, China's Africa relations have never been stronger. China has also been at the forefront of forging new and wide-ranging partnerships with Africa, serving as an engine of growth, increased trade, direct investment, aid, and other development activities on the continent. Not limited to government and large state-owned companies, several private Chinese companies have been part of the action in making the country a largely important economic actor in Africa. An example is Huawei, a Chinese global telecommunication provider with an investment of about $1.5 billion US dollars and an employer of over 4,000 workers in Africa. Of course, at the heart of China's trade and economic interest in Africa is the need for the country's for Africa's natural resources to sustain China's own rapid growth. For example, China imports 1/3 of its oil from Africa, with some of its investment tied to resource extraction. Angola, a beneficiary, has made its oil resources available to China in return for infrastructural projects. Having said that, China's engagement with Africa transcends oil and raw materials. It is multidimensional. Hence, China's role is likely to deepen significantly in the coming years. Moreover, an estimated over 1 million Chinese citizens whose activities are largely positive now live in the continent. There are many strengths in China's partnership with Africa, which I will not go into details, but I just to mention the availability of capital. Second, the willingness to invest in areas that the African countries identify as priority areas. Third, solutions and technologies which are relevant for Africa's interests and needs. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I would like to now mention and discuss some of the challenges to Africa-China relations. Africa's traditional development partners from the West have made veiled references to the danger of Africa's new colonialists. In particular, China's focus on securing access to natural resources has long been a source of debate, with critics arguing that its interests do not represent a long-term strategy and differ little from the previously exploitative relationship which have done little to support development on the African continent in the past. Fuels, ores, and metal account for almost 50% of all Chinese imports from Africa. But this point does not take into full account the breadth of Chinese investment in Africa, which now includes building railways and bridges that have nothing to do with mines and oil fields. The Chinese government has encouraged all sorts of activities in Africa, including construction, which actually account for 3/4 of recent private Chinese investments in Africa. China's companies are signing infrastructural deals worth more than $50 billion US a year. And investment in African farming, China has earmarked for that $5 billion US dollars. China's largest economic partners in the continent include non-resource-driven countries in the continent, such as South Africa, Mauritius, and Ghana, where Chinese firms have invested in banks, factories, telecommunications, and small shops. Recently, however, there has been some tensions in China-Africa's relations. Once feted as a savior in much of Africa, the Chinese have come to be viewed with some mixed feelings in others, particularly in smaller countries where China's weight is felt all the more. For example, on the downside, the quality of Chinese constructions has increasingly been called into question. Buildings erected by mainland firms have occasionally fallen apart. A hospital in Luanda, in the capital of Angola, was opened with great fanfare, but cracks appeared in the walls within a month and it soon closed. A Zambian road built by China from Lusaka, Zambia's capital, to Chirundu, 130 kilometers to the southeast, was quickly swept away by the rains. As a result of these experiences, African government and companies have become wary of promises and insist now more on quality rather than the quantity of promises and fulfillments. There are also concerns that in its dealings with African countries, China tends to pay scant attention to human rights abuses, especially in countries such as Zimbabwe, Sudan, and Angola. In China's view, of course, which was articulated in 2003 by Ambassador Zhang Yishan, Deputy Permanent Representative of China to the UN, I quote, "Externally imposed conditions do not offer genuine solutions to Africa's problem. The international community should therefore fully acquaint themselves with the real circumstances of the African countries, respect their sovereign choices and development strategies, and support the African continent's efforts to lift itself up by its own bootstrap." End of quotation. This attitude is, however, seen in some quarters as lowering the pressure on African governments to improve upon their records on human rights and good governance. Furthermore, according to an ADB, African Development Bank Group note, there is a risk of Chinese economic slowdown for Africa's development as the continent is vulnerable to economic shocks hitting China. From an average of GDP growth of more than 9% over the past 3 decades, a recent estimate by the IMF points to a projected slowing to 8.2% in 2012 and 8.8% in 2013. And because China's economic ties are largely resource-based, a fall in China's demand for African commodities could impact negatively on the current account and fiscal position of Africa. Similarly, lower growth in China could lead to contractions of credit lines to Africa from major Chinese banks. As trading in African accounts for 1/3 of China's Exim Bank's total assets, with some of the large Chinese financial deals, including $13 billion to Ghana and $6 billion to DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, continuing slowdown of the economy in China may well curtail a repetition of such huge financial transactions in favor of African countries. There are also some local complaints of poor treatment by Chinese managers and unfair wages payment by some Chinese private firms, which have been responsible for most recent unrest and even some deaths in the copper industry in southern Zambia as tensions came to a head when miners protested against poor conditions. There are also some reports of complaints in Ethiopia and Zambian farms against China's acquisition of large tracts of land at their expense. And while China-Africa relationship is regarded as being free from traditional conditionalities, there are other conditions present. There are some other conditions present in the relationship. For example, Chinese loans to African countries frequently require that the recipients spend the money with Chinese companies, thus reducing competition in terms of quality and price. Furthermore, China's work on infrastructural development on the continent is frequently tied to preferential trade agreement or access to natural resources. But considering all this, I want to look ahead and look forward to both the challenges and opportunities and make some recommendations. I would like to state that having looked at the balance sheet of China's relationship with African countries, it's my view that the opportunities to enhance China's Africa relations are much greater than the challenges, although those challenges are real and must be addressed in a serious and open manner. African countries also should not see themselves as being helpless in the relationship with China, although, of course, some are stronger than others in maximizing the benefits of China-African cooperation while minimizing the downsides of that relationship. In this regard, it's my view that African countries need to develop individual, sub-regional, and regional strategies for engaging China in a win-win scenarios. They should develop rules and laws to protect domestic interests of their workers and the environment and strengthen institutions to enforce them. It is also, in my view, of critical importance for African countries to leverage the gains from China's engagement with Africa. This is possible, especially in the areas of high competitiveness through skills acquisition and technological transfer, as well as infrastructure development brought about by China's investment opportunities in these areas. Again, according to the recent African Development Bank Group's paper on China's Africa relations, African countries should adopt policies aimed at the diversification of the future financing of their economic growth, especially in the face of a possible slowdown in China's economy. On its part, I think China should do the following in order to enhance and consolidate and sustain their relationship with the African continent. First, they should enhance the multidimensional character of their engagement with Africa. It is through China's identification with the major challenges facing Africa: security, development, democratization, and human rights, that, in my view, a sustainable and mutually rewarding relations with the continent can be built. In this regard, it is instructive to note that if you look at the first decades of independence for most African countries, China put political relations, ideological consideration above trade and economics in terms of a relation with the continent. In fact, at the earlier period, it was the late premier of China, Zhou Enlai, who once said, erroneously, that Africa was ripe for revolution. But it was politics and ideology above economic and trade relationship in the first few decades of the independence of most African countries. The next decade seems to see a bit of a reversal, where the emphasis was now on trade and investment. And I'm arguing that it's now time to put Africa's China relationship in the context of both economic and trade relationship, as well as the political. Second, I believe strongly and recommend that more and more Chinese companies should sign on to the United Nations Global Compact. For those who may not be aware, the Global Compact, which is endorsed by the UN, has 8,700 corporate participants from over 130 countries. The Global Compact is the largest voluntary corporate responsibility initiative in the world. The key principles of the Compact include support and respect for the internationally proclaimed human rights, upholding the rights of collective bargaining and freedom of association by labor, elimination of all sorts of forced and compulsory and child labor, promotion of greater environmental responsibility and environmentally friendly technologies, and working, of course, against corruption in all its forms. At present, there are only about 298 entities from China participating in the UN Global Compact for business entities. I'm suggesting that more Chinese companies should sign up to this Global Compact, and especially those that are operating in Africa. Third, in enhancing and consolidating its relation with African countries, China should work more closely with Africa's financial and development institutions, such as the African Development Bank, African Export-Import Bank, regional economic communities such as ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States in West Africa, and SADC in Southern Africa, as well as the new partnership for Africa development called NEPAD, an African Union organ, especially with emphasis on infrastructure development in the continent. These institutions have been gaining in status and in credibility within and outside Africa in terms of their efforts to promote sustainable development, public accountability, and good governance. I don't have the latest figures, but I understand that for Africa's Development Bank is so successful that the non-regionals, that is non-African countries, want to put more money and into the capitalization. It's the African countries that are holding back to say, hey, wait a minute, this is our bank. We want to retain the majority ownership, but it shows the kind of credibility and status that is gaining, and I believe China should work with successful, credible African institutions in promoting its relationship with the African continent. Fourth, I believe that China should identify with and encourage and provide concrete support for something called an innovation called the African Peer Review Mechanism, APRM. It's very unique. I don't know, maybe there's something similar in Europe, I'm not quite sure, but this is an initiative whereby the African countries agree to peer review themselves and to look at each other's compliance with provisions on good governance, both at the political level, at the economic level, and at the corporate level. It's a voluntary process to which 31 African countries have subscribed as of July 2012. That's 31 out of a total of 53. In my view, or my wish, all African countries should submit to this voluntary peer review mechanism. And if China were to then identify with and support and operate within those countries that subscribe to this voluntary mechanism of peer review in terms of economic governance, corporate governance, political governance, it seems to me then China will be helping to address issues which the African countries themselves consider important for their countries, for their continent's social, economic, and political development. At the same time, in my view, China will be responding positively to some of the concerns in the West about the downside of its relationship with Africa in terms of being soft on human rights and governance issues. In taking the above steps, both on the part of the Africans and on the part of the Chinese, I think both sides will find each other dependable and trustworthy ally, as well as business partner. I recall in one of my previous assignments as chairman of the United Nations Special Committee Against Apartheid, which successfully contributed to the demise of apartheid in South Africa. During the waning period of apartheid, I recalled a conversation I had with the biggest businesses in South Africa. And I asked their leaders, how come you decided, you used to support the apartheid regime, how come you decided to support the African National Congress, the party of Mandela? You used to say that the business of business is simply business, and you have no interest in politics. And they told me something that is very instructive, and I think is very important in the context of Africa's future relationship with the Chinese. They told me, they said, Mr. Gambari, you know, we used to think that the business of business is simply business, but we now realize that the business of business is to stay in business. The business of business is to stay in business. And I am arguing that even if the motivation, the principal motivation of China is simply trade and business, okay, yes, the business of that business should also be how to remain in business. And it is by taking the steps, in my view, that I've outlined above, on the part of the Africans and on the part of the Chinese, that then we will have a relationship that will be sustainable, that will be good for Africa, it will be good for China, and ultimately it will be good